Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We're excited to have one of our very own project managers, Gino presenting on migrating BC or NAV on-premise to Azure best practices. And I know you're all eager to get started with this presentation, so before I pass it over to Gino, I just want to remind you that we are recording this webinar and we will post it to our on-demand webinar library for you to review again or share with anyone. And if you have any questions during our presentation, please feel free to type them in the questions box and we will answer them at the end of our session during our Q&A time. So now I'm going to pass it on over to Gino to kick off our presentation.
Thank you, Angie. Good afternoon, good morning. Hello, everybody. Thank you and those of you who are watching on demand, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about migrating Business Central or NAV on-premise to Azure. And talk about a little bit the different options that you have and the best practices surrounding those options. As Angie mentioned, my name is Gino Pack. I'm a project manager here at Innovia Consulting. I've been at Innovia for just going on 2 years now, and before that, I was an IT manager for an eyewear manufacturing and distribution company. And I spent about 10 years there, and I worked with NAV quite frequently at my previous company, and worked with it more permanently here when moving over to the partner side. So I'm excited to be here. When taking a look at our agenda today, these are a couple of things that we're going to be talking through. So I'm just going to give a quick 1,000-foot overview of what Azure is, because it may be new to some of those listening to the webinar today. And then we're going to talk about our NAV and Business Central deployment models, the options that you have for deploying NAV, Business Central, and Azure. And then based off those deployment models, I'm going to give some best practices that are provided by Microsoft and just from our own Innovia experience on deploying to Azure, and then some other things that you have to think about when you're deploying as well.
Gino,
So what is
I do
Azure?
have that poll.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you so much. So thank you for the reminder, Angie. So everyone, there are going to be a couple polls that are popping up here on the screen. So when you get a chance, go ahead and give them an answer, and it just gives me an idea of who what the roles are and what what your current deployment model is, so I can gear my conversation to that. Helps me get to know those who are on the call as well. So thank you in advance for answering those. So what is Azure? So this is the broad definition that's taken from Microsoft's website. Microsoft Azure is commonly referred to as Azure, is a cloud computing service created by Microsoft for building, testing, deploying, and managing applications and services through a Microsoft managed data center. That's a lot to take in. So in short, Azure takes your data center that you have located in your facility. Oops, I think I moved something to the screen here. Takes your data center located in your building and hosts it within Microsoft's data centers. It takes the capital of the expense of you owning your own servers and hosting your own environment in a private data center, and it puts them in Microsoft's port. What's nice about it, as I mentioned before, is it takes the capital expense of large amounts of hardware and licensing away from you. And Microsoft's pricing for their data centers and their services is typically charged by the utilization. So instead of paying a large monthly fee, you're paying for the resources that you're using. And here's just some examples of what Microsoft's services look like. So they have their platform services that just give you, so you can do web and mobile and computing power and database work, along with security and hybrid operations, which ties your on-premise environment to your cloud environment. And then you have your infrastructure services, which is basically taking your networking and your compute and your virtual machines or your servers inside your building and storing them in Microsoft's environment. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So we're gonna jump into how does NAV and Business Central come into play with the Microsoft Azure infrastructure and the Microsoft Azure environment. Now, I'm just gonna forewarn everybody, just excuse me if I jump between NAV and Business Central, you know, because Microsoft has changed the name over the last couple of years here, and I've been around a while where I know it as Navision, I know it as NAV, and now it's Business Central. So when I'm talking about them today, they're gonna be one and the same. Okay, so NAV is Business Central is NAV. So
Gino, I have launched that second poll.
Perfect, thank you, Angie, appreciate it. So previously, NAV and Navision really only had one method of hosting your application. With advances in technology and the changes in versions in NAV and Business Central, you have now many different options on at your disposal to deploy your ERP system. These are the four that are available today. So you have your on-premise installation, which is the most common one that everyone is used to hearing about. Is you manage everything. You manage from your hardware to your software, and then and so on and so forth. The second method is your infrastructure as a service, or infrastructure as a service model. The infrastructure as a service model is where you're handing over your infrastructure management to somebody else. So you're basically taking the servers out of your server room and giving them to someone else. In this case, we're talking about Azure. You still manage the database, you still manage your Windows Server operating systems, but the server setup the hardware setup and the networking setup is all done in Azure. The third model is platform as a service. Here, you're taking the database portion away and you're giving it to Microsoft. So Microsoft is managing your SQL instance and your SQL database. And the last one is your SaaS model. Your infrastructure, your application, and your database is managed by someone else, in this case, Microsoft. All you have to do is really just activate the service and you're good to go. This is kind of the model that Microsoft has been pushing for by integrating Business Central into its Microsoft stack, alongside its Microsoft 365 applications. Today, we're going to be focusing on Business Central on-premise. So when you're talking about Business Central and NAV, there are still really only two installation methods for Business Central and NAV. One is on-premise, which encompasses on-prem, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service. And then the last model is SaaS, which is its own. Today, we're only focusing on two of those on-premise types of installations. The first one is your infrastructure as a service, and then the second is the platform as a service. Let's start by looking at the platform as a service. So let's look at infrastructure as a service first. With infrastructure as a service, the environment would be set up similar to the way you would set up your on-premise installation of Business Central. There are typically 2 to 3 components of your installation, depending on the version of NAV or Business Central that you're using. You have your SQL Server, your application, your NAV or Business Central application installation, and then you have your client install. Now, depending on which version of NAV and Business Central that you're running, the web client is the only client that's offered by Business Central, starting with version 15. So the web client utilizes Internet Information Services, or IIS, which is a web server provided on any Microsoft server platform. And that's what it utilizes to run the client service for newer versions of Business Central. So the two deployment scenarios that you have is your first one is your NAV and Business Central service, and your SQL Server and database can all be on the same Azure virtual machine. The second deployment model, your NAV and Business Central service, your SQL Server, can be on their own Azure virtual machines. So what does that topology look like? So here's what the topology looks like for the NAV and Business Central, your NAV and Business Central service. Let's see if I got my pointer here. I don't see the pointer. So for the NAV and Business Central service, you would have it all on one server. Okay, so you have your SQL Server database and its components, your NAV server, and then your web server components for the client, and everything would be connected to one server. Now, your best practices on those is, you have your limited number of concurrent users. So typically, we say that around 20 to 25 concurrent users can utilize this single virtual machine model. You want to make sure that you're limiting the amount of RAM that SQL Server tries to hog. That way you're not taking it away from the NAV application. So what I would do is I would split the SQL Server RAM utilization 50-50 with the NAV application. And then if you're using the web client, you need to consider its usage as well, because remember, it's using Internet Information Services to run the web service for the client. And that also takes resources. So if you do want to go this route, what I would recommend is that you would want to consider the size of the virtual machine that you're creating. Increase the RAM and increase the CPU to accommodate the additional workload of all the services that are running. This is a good option if you're just getting into, if you have a low amount of concurrent users, you're looking for some cost savings, and you're looking for a low cost environment on a monthly reoccurring side to host your NAV environment in business, or your NAV and Business Central environment in Azure. The second method is putting your NAV and BC service and your SQL service on multiple virtual machines. Okay, this is the most common model that's out here. So the topology sort of looks like this. So if you have your SQL database and SQL Server installation on one server, and then you have your NAV services and your web server on another. Okay. The model that I'm showing here shows your web server, which runs your Business Central client, and your NAV services and Business Central services are on a separate server. So really there's 3 virtual machines here. But most of the time you can get away with having only 2. So your NAV services and your web server running your client will be on the same server, and then SQL will be separate. So when you're having multiple virtual machines, the best practices surrounding this is when you have a high number of concurrent users. This method, this topology offers the best performance. So any environment around over 25 users should use this type of method. It provides the best performance, as I mentioned, and it's the best option for scalability. So if you need to resize the machines, if you need to grow, this provides the best option for that. What you also want to do is create your virtual machines within the same Azure region. So as you're building your virtual machines, you can choose where you want those virtual machines stored. And typically your regions are, Central US, East US, West US, and then depending on the country you're in, you can move the data to the country that you're located in. So I would keep it in the same region, so that way you minimize the latency, and then you can utilize Azure proximity placement groups to place these servers within the same data center. Okay, so typically in Azure region, these is like, for instance, if you use like a central Azure region, central US Azure region, that could encompass multiple data centers, not just one. Okay, by using Azure proximity groups, what you're doing is you're ensuring those virtual machines are in the same data center and close to each other. That way it lowers the amount of latency within the network when your machines are communicating with each other. And then when you're setting up your SQL Server, there are multiple best practices that you want to follow as well. You never want to store your database and your log files on the C drive of your server. Just very bad practice, because if it fills up and your operating system has nothing to run off of, your server won't even start. You want to separate your log data and temp DB files as well, as you can see here. This provides better read-write speeds. So your data files will go in one drive, your SQL will go in, and your SQL logs will go in another, and your temp database will go in another. And then some will also separate out their SQL backups as well and toss those in another drive. If you're formatting your volumes or your drives with an NTFS file structure, you'll want to do a cluster size of 64 kilobytes. That way it provides better read speeds. And then you also want to maintain your disaster recovery solution. Just because you are storing your virtual machines in Azure does not mean they will never become corrupt. It does not mean they will that your data will never become corrupt. It does not mean that the machine will never fail to start. So you still want to make sure that you're always maintaining your disaster recovery solution, whether that be replicating the virtual machine out to another Azure solution or taking backups of your SQL to a cloud backup solution, and also pulling a SQL database down every once in a while and doing a test restore. Those are all still very valid, even though your data and your server environment is in Azure. Overall, when you're using infrastructure as a service, you'll want to utilize premium storage. Premium storage is utilizing SSDs as your storage. Azure offers several different types of storage options. So they offer standard hard drives, standard SSDs, premium SSDs, and what are called ultra SSDs. All provide different read-write speeds. I would recommend going with a premium SSD model. The pricing has leveled out tremendously, so it's fairly inexpensive to implement premium SSDs now. And then also the premium and ultra SSDs are covered by Microsoft's uptime SLAs. If you use standard SSDs and standard hard drives, Microsoft does not cover them under their SLAs. And also there are multiple cost savings that come along with it as well that you can take advantage of, especially if you're a smaller business. The first one is Azure hybrid benefits. This comes with, you already have on-premise environments and you already own Windows Server and SQL Server licensing. If you own that already, you don't have to pay for it again. You can take advantage of hybrid benefits. So if you have any questions around, Windows licensing, or if you're in a volume license agreement, talk to your Innovia account manager, because there is a good chance that you can take advantage of the Azure hybrid benefits option when creating virtual machines. That way you don't have to pay for the Microsoft licensing again. And then the other one is Azure reserved instances. So what you can do is you can sign an agreement for up to 3 years with Azure saying, okay, well, I'm going to keep my machines here for up to 3 years. If you have both of those cost-saving measures in place, you can save up to 50% if you take advantage of them. That is a tremendous cost savings, and it makes putting your infrastructure in Azure extremely affordable. You would want to, when you're building out machines, Microsoft gives you the option of choosing the type of machines that you would like to use. They have D or F series machines. Both provide very general server compute, RAM, and processing power. It provides a very good balance over what between the compute and RAM, in your server environments. And then of course, you'd always want to use SSL or secure certificates to secure the traffic between your on-site machines in Azure as well. That's very important. The second method I want to talk about today is platform as a service. So what you're doing is you're taking your SQL database and you're giving it to Azure. So Microsoft provides a service called SQL Azure. And instead of putting SQL Server on a standard business or standard Windows virtual machine, what it is a database service that Microsoft provides. So it's a relational database as a service utilizing Microsoft SQL Server engine. And I do want to be clear that Azure SQL database is not a SQL server. Okay, it's different. It's built and it's optimized for the cloud. Okay, but there's many advantages to it. You don't have to pay for SQL Server licensing with it. It's included with the service. And it's scalable. So you can change the resources on the fly to gain better performance when your Azure SQL environment. And then it's also a great cost-effective solution as well, and typically costs less than deploying a SQL server or a virtual machine with SQL Server installed on it. Okay, now, and what's really cool about Azure SQL as well, it's got great performance monitoring tools. So if you're not a DBA, you can take advantage of using Microsoft or Azure SQL Performance Monitor, and you can monitor all your database activities and apply optimizations without having to understand what stored procedures are or stuff like that. You have the Microsoft, after a day of monitoring, Microsoft can provide you recommendations on how to increase performance in your environment. So with some of these deployment recommendations, Azure SQL size and performance is calculated by what's called DTUs. Okay, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're researching what the DTU cost is and how it outweighs versus a full SQL install. Now, what's great is Microsoft gives a performance or pricing calculator on their website. If you go to Azure's website and look up the Azure pricing calculator, it will allow you to do a cost comparison between a virtual machine install of SQL Server and utilizing Azure SQL, Azure SQL instance to see where where it's best for you to flip from using Azure SQL and using a virtual machine with Azure or with SQL installed on it. And then obviously you're still going to need someplace to run your NAV and Business Central service tier as well. So you're still going to deploy your one virtual machine to run your NAV and Business Central service tier, and you just want to make sure that that virtual machine is in the same region as your Azure SQL database or instance as well. So with that, I do want to open it up for questions, Angie.
Thank you, Gino. Yes, we did have a question that came through. What is the oldest version of NAV supported by Azure?
Okay, great question. So we have had customers implement NAV 2009. So first of all, you need to be running NAV on SQL. Okay, so that's at least, so you need to be doing that. And I would say that we've installed NAV 2009 clients or NAV 2009 instances in Azure in an Azure setup, and they have typically run very well. Okay, so I would at least not go further back than NAV 2009. If you want to take advantage of Azure SQL, the only version of NAV that started supporting Azure SQL is NAV 2016. So starting at NAV 2016 and newer, you can utilize the platform as a service Azure SQL. Anything before that, it would just be virtual machines running NAV.
Okay, thank you, Gino. If anybody has any further questions, please go ahead and get those typed in, and Gino can address them for you. And I'll just give you a few moments and let you know that we do have more webinars coming up. Tomorrow, we actually have new view strategies, and they will be presenting on 9 questions about business performance you can answer with your BC financial statements. And then next Wednesday, March 10th, we have Insight Works presenting on Supercharge Business Central Cloud with free apps. So check out our website events and register for any of those webinars that are interesting to you, and we'll get you all set up. Okay, Gino, I don't think there's any questions. I think you covered everything.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you letting me talk today.
All right, well, thank you, Gino, for presenting, and for everyone on our webinar today, or if you're watching on demand, we thank you for taking some time out to join us. And if you have not heard about our new training workshops that are going on now, we have a variety to choose from. And you can find out more information on each of those workshops at innovia.com/workshops. So register for those and select which one best fits you. And we do have a podcast. It's been going on for a couple of years now. Our hosts, Steve Waltz and Jeff Pergolski, have provided many different podcasts that you can listen to. So check out our podcast page and you can subscribe so that you won't miss any of those new episodes when they air. All right, everyone, we thank you for joining us and we look forward to seeing you soon on another Innovia webinar. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time.